I'm going to talk now about plans, as in sort of largish scale plans over weeks, perhaps months, for creativity. Say for creativity, for innovation, the words have slightly different meaning, but for things where you need a creative step, but not necessarily, I'm not thinking, as Einstein here, I'm thinking more the kinds of creative step you need in your day-to-day user experience, software development, whatever particular aspect you're after. Crucially, innovation is often attached to risk, and creativity is attached to risk. And typically, risk, when people say risk, they're thinking high gain, but also a possibility of failure. And that's fine, apart from sometimes you can't afford to fail. So what you really want, ideally, are high gain, but low risk activities. So things where you're guaranteed to get something, but you might get something really good. And that's what I'd like to talk about, ways to achieve that. So there's high risks or innovative strategies seem to be risk of failure. Conservative ones, low risk but not very exciting. Can we get both worlds, the best of both worlds? The typical way, when you think about plans, right, if you're going to go and write your Gantt chart or whatever, you think of them as not necessarily linear. You might have parallel activities, but lots of small steps where you're saying, I'm going to do this on these days, these on these days, this person's doing this person's doing that. All pre-planned, guaranteed outcome. You know that you can achieve each of the steps. You know that if you do each of the steps, you get to the end and you've got your result. Brilliant, but maybe a little boring. So again, can we do something a bit better than that? Well, of course, there's the creative plan. So a classic, and now this is both something you might informally do, but also I have seen formally written plans like this, which you can think of as the spark from heaven plan. So you have a series of activities that perhaps happen up front, and then your plan, I said you might not write it down, but your plan is basically that you wait for the spark of creativity. There's the big bright idea. Once you've got your bright idea, you move on. So I've seen things like research or development plans that say, first of all, we're going to review what's there. And then we'll invent the new method, the new toolkit, the new way of doing something. Spark from heaven plans, brilliant when they work, disaster when they don't. So this is a classic high-risk plan. So how can you modify this kind of big, bright idea plan to make something that's more likely to succeed while still having the opportunity to produce really good things? One kind of plan that works quite well, I found, are incremental output plans. Now this works perhaps, well, we'll talk about some examples actually later. If you're writing, it might be about writing things that come in units so that you can deliver things. If you're producing software, it might be producing something minimal and then additional parts. But the basic idea is you have a linear plan, or it doesn't have to be linear, it can be a branch, but think of a linear plan with multiple stages where each stage might require little sparks of insight, but smaller sparks. So smaller sparks spread out. But then crucially at each stage, so you've got those high risk elements. I said normally they're dangerous, but because you've broken them up, the likelihood is that one of them will happen. And this can be highly linearized, so you have to have the first one first, but it's smaller bright ideas, you're more likely to have it. Or it might be actually you could do things in different orders and be a bit more speculative about which order you do things. But crucially, each stage, when you have the spark of insight related to that stage, has a related output. And so at every point, from the first stage or two, you actually have something that you could deliver. Now, from an overall management point of view, from a project management point of view, knowing you've got something, even if it's not what you really like, is brilliant. And it's particularly good if you've got a limited time. So there are different kinds of constraints in time. Sometimes it's the amount of time you've got to spend on it in total, but often there's a hard deadline. If there's a hard deadline, you have to deliver something by that deadline, then actually a plan that's guaranteed to give something, even if it's not the most wonderful thing at that deadline, is a good plan. The more of the stages you go through, the better the plan you have. And if you fail on the last one, so what? You've missed a little bit, but you've still got something pretty good. Examples of that in agile development methods. I'm sure a lot of you have worked with agile development teams. You're often based around user story or a scenario based one, where you take a particular user story and say, we're going to, this week, this fortnight, this month, depending on how long you do your sprints over, we're going to implement this slice of functionality. You implement that one, then you move on to a different one. You need to have a level of innovation, a level of, this is true both from the development point of view, from the user experience design point of view. You need your sparks for those stages, but each one is a relatively contained thing that you can finish. The other thing is that if you have a palette of them, what you might do is during your sort of review, your weekly review meetings about where you're at, you might actually choose to do the story where you've got a pretty good idea of what you're going to do. So effectively use the sparks to drive the order in which you do the stories. So you have a number of stories that you want to implement that are part of what you'd like to do. You do those. Now this is related to the whole idea of a minimum viable product. So is there something you can produce that you can get out there that does the job? And then you've got a roadmap, wish list, that you might do in a particular order, and then it's a matter of waiting to do those creative steps for each one. Or it might be that if you've got a roadmap, a wish list of things to do, when you sort of realise, that's how we can do that one, you get on and do that one rather than the rest. So it's almost like have a menu of creative things that require creative steps, but each one of which, when you do them, you can add to that minimum viable product, make it a more extensive one, something that's more appealing. It's similar in the sense that it reduces risk, although actually very different as well. You think of it as a backburner activity plan. So the idea here is you have your classic spark from heaven plan, where you've got something and you're waiting for the big idea. But what you do is, in addition, you have a parallel activity that you can get on with. Now, sometimes that's related but not the same. So imagine you've got actually an application idea of your own you're trying to develop, and you think it's going to be great, but it takes time and you certainly need a certain amount of insight to hit your head. So what you do is you're doing consultancy work. It's in the same general area, so it helps feed your brain with ideas, but pays for your bread and butter, allows you to live and to pay your rent and everything while you develop your new bright idea. So that might be it. Or it might be a low risk path to the same outcome. So you have a project you have to do, and you'll think, again, we'll go back to the to-do list application. So you have to develop a to-do list app. You've got to do it. You know what to-do lists look like, applications. There's a gazillion to-do list apps. So you could just do yet another to-do list app. So what you do is you get on with doing that, but at the same time you're thinking about novel and different ways to do it. Because you're doing something related, it's feeding in. So as you get on with the bread and butter to-do list app that's sort of just doing its job but in a fairly boring way, it's keeping your mind thinking about to-do list apps. And hopefully if that one is make it more likely, and then if the sudden yes idea comes, you then effectively shift into doing the more creative but high risk activity. It's quite nice too if the steps that you're doing in the high risk activity can feed back into the low risk one. So you might, that's less true if there's like one huge big idea, but the low risk activity might have itself be a bit more like the incremental, would have a series of things, and you might perhaps, having done one of them, be able to feed some of those ideas back into your more day-to-day mundane plan for producing to-do list application. So the idea is to have something that you just know you can get on with, will produce a result. That result might be earning your money so that you can live, it might be producing the application at the end, but something else in parallel which sort of sits there. And is it what you really want to do? And when the ideas come for it, you get on with it. Okay, that's a backburner activity. The other thing you can do, which is sort of essential for the incremental one, but is a general strategy, and it's sort of like blatantly obvious, this is take that one big idea, can you break it down? Can you think of things that are smaller, but when you've done them all, either means that you've done the big activity, or sometimes are just preparatory, but each one of them is of value in itself, and often the last small idea you need is how to pull them all back together to bring back into the big idea. So ways of breaking things down. So you can think about activities. I mean, there's multiple dimensions, and I'm going to push it down to 2 because otherwise you can't see it on a slide. Let's think about the things that you're doing in terms of two axes. One is in terms of complexity. How complex is it? Something really simple or something that's a really complicated thing. And in terms of the amount of creative energy required. How creative do you need to be to do the task? Now, there are some things that are both really simple in terms of complexity and don't require a lot of creativity. So I can go out and make a cup of tea for myself anytime. That's low creativity, low complexity tasks to do. If you've got a load of those to do, sometimes they can be a useful back burner activity, but one thing particularly I often find myself trying to do is clear the decks of those, because they can take over your life. In the Pebbles and Boulders model, they're the Pebbles, so one is they can take over and there's too many of them, but often the fact that they're sitting there in your head, you've got to do these little tasks. I often find if you can spend a bit of time, get them out of the way, that's useful. So there's strategy. So again, you might have different strategies, but they have a particular strategy for dealing with them. Or you might say, I'm going to schedule a day a week for doing these, or an hour in the morning for doing those tasks. That's it. I prefer to produce biggest possible ones, so I might go for the day a week, but I said it does depend on your schedule, the way you work, how it's going to do. The other kind of thing, you might have things which don't require much creativity but are quite complicated. Now, that's weird, but things can be big-ish, and yet you just know that if you get on with them, they'll happen. For those, if you're wanting to do something two things you can do with those. One is you can deliberately schedule them for later, so you can move them off into the future. I sometimes talk about Micawber management, the use of procrastination, but as a positive thing. And this is an example of Micawber management. You're saying, I know there's this complicated thing, it's going to take a lot of effort. What I might want to do is just say, but I know because it's not going to require huge amounts of creative insight, that this will take me a day, a week, an hour. Where's its deadline? When do I need to do it? Push it off. So into the future. The other thing you might do with these is use them in that back burner model as the parallel filler activity. So the thing to do whilst you're waiting for the big idea, basically. The thing you have to be a little bit careful with these using that is if they're complicated but are taking mental energy, then they get in the way of the creative thought. However, that by very definition pushes them up into the bigger emotional or creative energy tasks. So if they're low creative energy, if they're things you can just get on with but are quite complex, then you might do them as your back burner activity whilst you're doing the things that you have to sort of perhaps wait for that moment when that's right, get on with it. Okay, let's look at the top left of this thing now. So things which are low complexity but require a substantial amount of creativity. So these are little puzzles, it might be as simple as what name should I give for this menu item? It's that kind of thing. Or, but they're things that, you do have to think about, do require a bit of processing, so they're eating up your creative thinking, but they're relatively small. These are often little fun tasks, actually, because you know you're going to get them done. You know they're not such a huge thing that you think, oh my goodness, will I ever think of that many names? You know you're going to do it. You might have some strategies for helping you doing it. There is a category of things up here, though, that are not fun, and I'm rubbish. You'll have different ones, but I'm rubbish at like sending certain emails. Some emails are fine, but there's ones where I'm just worried about how to phrase it. So it's not so much creative energy as emotional energy. And what I will do is I can spend a day not doing that task. So for those things, these things which are more problematic, again, you either want to try and clear the decks of them, so I'm going to push it down to the bottom, or even though it's quite small, put it off, schedule it so that it's not that it's forgotten. You know it's not forgotten, and it may, but hopefully by scheduling it into the future, it makes it less of a weight on your mind. Okay, now the gap, right, the yawning void here on this diagram is the things that require creativity, but are also complex. I said we're not talking about complex in the Einstein general relativity sense, but in the new idea of how you're going to organize this new application in some way that's going to be different from your competitors, and yet it's going to be easy to use, it's going to be immediately attractive when they first see it, and it's going to continue to enthrall them for weeks and years to come. So this is non-trivial stuff. This is the Nirvana period. This is it, right? But it's hard. These are the hard things. What good planning should do is help you to break that down into things that are either actually require no creativity at all, or are these lower grade things, these things that require those creative insights but are more fragmented.